Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Allison Murtha. I am the manager and a forensic scientist at R.J. Lee Group in their forensics department. Welcome to day number 1 of our webinar series, Gunshot Residue Analysis for Law Enforcement. Today's series will include sample collection and sample submission. Day 2 of our webinar series will be about sample analysis and some testimony considerations. There's still room in our day 2 webinar series, so feel free to jump on that link and sign up, and we'll be looking forward to seeing you there as well. I'd like to now introduce you to the 2 individuals that you will be hearing from today. You will be hearing from Mr. Michael Gorski about sample collection. He is a forensic scientist in the forensic science department. And you will also be hearing from Mrs. Marcia Hess, our project coordinator in the forensic science department. She will be talking about sample submission. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Michael Gorski. Mike?
Good afternoon. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about gunshot residue sample collection. We're going to discuss who you want to sample from, when you want to sample, where you want to sample, and also considerations to take into account when actually performing the sampling. Before we get into sample collection, I want to briefly touch on what gunshot residue, or GSR, is. Gunshot residue is the material that comes out of a firearm whenever it is discharged. This material includes elements from the gun primer, the gun powder, and also the firearm and ammunition itself. The portion of material that we are going to focus on today, the material that can link particles to a firearm's discharge, originates from the primer. The primer typically contains 3 elements that are highly specific to the discharge of a firearm whenever all 3 of those elements are found together in one particle. Those elements are lead, antimony, and barium. When a firearm is discharged, those elements originating from the primer can land on the hands, clothing, and surrounding area of the shooter. To hear a little bit more about the GSR particulate, as well as testimony considerations, please be sure to tune into day 2 of our webinar series. Now let's talk about collecting those particles that may have landed on the hands, clothing, and surrounding areas of the potential shooter. When collecting samples for GSR analysis, the only type of kits that should be used are SEM, or scanning electron microscopy kits. These kits are really the industry standard. GSR hand and surface kits can be purchased from a variety of different manufacturers, including Tritech, Searchy, Arrowhead, as well as R.J. Lee Group. The samples in the kit are what we refer to as a stub. A stub is an aluminum pin mount encapsulated in a plastic vial. The pin mount has an adhesive material on it that is used for the actual collection. Kits can contain anywhere from 2 to 5 sample stubs. Some kits only have stubs for the right hand and the left hand, and others, like R.J. Lee Groups, have 5 stubs. Stubs for the right back, the right palm, the left back, the left palm, and a control stub. It's really up to you and your agency as what type of kit to purchase. If you're ever in a pinch and do not have access to a GSR SEM kit, do not use a Q-tip or swab. At the very, very least, use a small amount of packing tape. However, if you have clothing or another item in-house for collection and are in need of a kit, give us a call and we'll quickly give you one free of charge. Now I'm going to go over the who, or what, you can collect from. GSR samples can be collected from a suspected shooter's hands or face area using those SEM stubs. At times, we do receive samples from victims' hands as well, and we can analyze for you if you deem them probative to the case. However, it would not be very unusual to see GSR on a victim of a gunshot wound. So typically, samples we received are from suspected shooters. Samples can also be collected from a suspect's clothing or other items related to the subject. This is sometimes a more probative path to take, especially if it has been several hours or even days after a shooting incident. GSR particles may tend to adhere longer to clothing than to the skin of a shooter. This is because the particles can get trapped in the weave of the fabric that the clothing is made out of. Typically, an individual is going to have washed himself or herself more often than they would have washed their clothing. Vehicles can also be a good source to collect GSR from if you suspect a firearm may have been discharged from within or next to a vehicle. Items that can be analyzed, including samples from hands, vehicles, all types of clothing, cell phones, helmets, sunglasses, purses, jewelry, just to name a few. Use your judgment. Think about what item is most likely to retain the most GSR after a certain amount of time has elapsed. And always, if you have any questions, just give us a call. We'll be sure to answer your questions. Now I'm going to go over the when. So when do you want the sampling to occur? So we frequently get asked on the stand when you should collect samples for gunshot residue analysis. The simplest answer to this question is to collect them as soon as possible after the incident. There are some labs out there that have what are called cutoff times. For example, if a suspected shooter isn't apprehended and samples aren't collected before a certain hourly time frame of a shooting incident, some labs will not accept the samples for analysis. This is because there are several factors, such as running, weather, activity, that can cause particulate loss. RJ Lee Group does not utilize a cutoff time, believing instead to follow what the investigating officers feel are instructions of probative value. Now, if you collect samples from a suspect's hands 3 days after a shooting, we will analyze them for you if that's what you want us to do. But the chances of still finding any GSR particulate are very unlikely. 3 days after a shooting, the probative value of collecting samples from an individual's hands decreases tremendously. It's cases like that that you want to look into taking samples from a subject's clothing or any other items worn during the time of the suspected shooting. Now I'm going to go over the where. So where should you actually collect the samples? If you should collect the samples as soon as possible, that typically means that you will be collecting samples at the scene. By collecting samples at the scene, there are fewer opportunities for contamination to be introduced and fewer chances for movement or activity of a subject over a period of time. However, we do realize that it's not always possible to collect samples at the scene. When you cannot collect at the scene, it is very important to bag the subject's hands. A brown paper bag over each hand of the subject will protect any possible contamination that could originate from a police officer's handcuffs or contamination that could originate from the back seat of a police vehicle. When collecting samples from the hands of a subject or bagging a subject before handcuffing him or her, we always recommend wearing latex gloves, and please do so. A pair of latex gloves serves to protect any potential transfer of particles from you to the subject. They also serve to protect you in court when you are questioned about best practices when collecting samples. Now I'm going to go over some considerations to consider when choosing what to actually sample and collect. There are many things to consider when collecting samples for gunshot residue. There are certain factors which can contribute to particle loss. These factors can play a role into whether or not samples will have probative value for analysis. So the first factor is, let's say, movement, motion, or activity. These are big factors which could potentially cause particulate loss. And the more time that passes, the more potential there is for particulate or particles to be lost. Washing hands, wiping hands on clothing, putting hands in and out of pockets, running, shaking hands with other people. These are all activities that could cause particles to be removed. This is also why clothing may be a better option for you to consider sampling if a long amount of time has passed since the incident. It may also be important to note a subject activities prior to the incident as well. For example, if a subject states that on the morning of the incident he or she went to the gun range or that they went hunting, then finding GSR on them wouldn't really be that unusual. At that point, GSR analysis may not be very useful or a viable option for you in this investigation. Weather and airflow might affect the number of particles detected on a suspected shooter. When shooting incidents can occur outside, wind, rain, snow, or humidity could also wash away particles or affect the amount of particles that are deposited or particles that land on the shooter. Shooting incidents that occur inside can be affected by the movement of the air in the room. So let's say, for example, fans, air conditioners, or even having the windows open may affect particulate loss or the number of particles that can be deposited on a suspected shooter or the area. So another consideration to take into account might be blood or other biological material. So this biological material can act as a mask for particles that are on a subject's hands or clothing, making them not readily able to be collected. When collecting samples, it is important to try and sample around the areas that have a lot of biological material present. So contamination from other sources is another issue to consider when collecting samples. Officers collecting from subjects need to be especially cautious as they and their surroundings can potentially contain GSR particulate. As mentioned previously, wear gloves and be aware of potential contamination sources around a collection area. If possible, have an unarmed officer collect the samples. It is not uncommon to find only one or a few GSR particles on a case sample, and you do not want to be a possible source of these particles. As I stated previously, if collection cannot be done at the scene, it is highly recommended that the subject's hands be bagged before being cuffed. This is done to prevent any contamination from getting onto the subject's hands. If you will be collecting samples at your agency, be sure to wear gloves, ensure a clean environment. For example, don't collect samples in a ballistics unit, and clean surfaces before the subject is brought in for sampling. Make sure to lay out paper, do things that will prevent contamination. We also want you to consider packaging. When you are packaging clothing to be sent for sample collection, the items should be packaged individually so no contamination or cross-contamination in this instance could occur. Each article of clothing can be wrapped in butcher paper and then placed in separate evidence bags. Now let's take a closer look at the Gunshot Residue Hand Kit. This particular hand kit contains 5 stubs, so stubs for the back and palm of the right hand and back and palm of the left hand, as well as a control stub. When using the right back or right palm stub, that should correspond to the subject's right hand. The left back or left palm stub should correspond to the subject's left hand. The control stub is a stub that can be utilized however you see fit. It can be used to sample the area or room in which the samples are being collected to prove that it is free of GSR particles, or it can be used to sample the hands of the individual doing the collecting. Some agencies choose to use the control stub as a kind of batch control to prove that there is nothing present on the stubs before they are being used to sample. The use of a control stub is completely and totally up to you, but using them does help to bolster credibility in the courtroom. The first step is to prepare yourself before collecting samples. Take note in the picture. The individual doing the collection is wearing appropriate personal protective equipment with latex gloves while doing the sampling. So now I'm going to go over how to actually sample from a suspect's hands. This image would be representative of the back right hand of a suspected shooter. So the method used to sample areas of interest is called particle extraction. It's basically a simple dabbing motion. First, you want to remove the cap from the stub. Then you place the stub face down on the area of interest. In this picture, we are seeing the right back of the hand, and every circle represents one individual dabbing motion. When sampling hands, you want to focus first on the area that usually has the greatest concentration of particles, the area and webbing between the individual's thumb and forefinger. This is shown in these white circles. Once that is complete, you want to start dabbing up and down the hand in a vertical motion, ensuring to cover the entire hand. Be sure when you dab that you put the stub down and then bring it right back up. Please do not drag the stub along the surface of the skin. That could cause the adhesive to curl up on itself, degrade, or possibly mask particles that are being present. So these blue dots represent a vertical motion of dabbing across the subject's hands. So once you have dabbed over the hand in the vertical direction. You want to dab over the hand in the horizontal direction, and that's what's going to be represented by these black dots. This will create a grid-like pattern over the entire hand, ensuring that the entire hand has been sampled. So now I'm going to go over some sample collection from, let's say, an article of clothing. When sampling clothing or other items, the same method of particle extraction is used. The dabbing technique is applied in a vertical and horizontal direction, creating a grid-like pattern over the area of interest. When samples are taken from clothing, typically more than one sample is needed. This is because the adhesive properties of the stub will wear off over time and in the amount of area being sampled. As an example, when collecting samples from a long-sleeve t-shirt, jacket, or sweater, as shown in the picture, we would use 4 different stubs to sample the item. One for the right sleeve, one for the right front side, one for the left front side, and one for the left sleeve. This ensures that the entire area of the sweater would be sampled. Other areas of clothing that can be sampled are based upon what you feel is of probative value. For example, it is possible to particle extract from, let's say, the pockets or waistbands if you believe that a recently discharged firearm may have been holstered in those areas. So it's really up to you. Particle extractions of clothing and other items, let's say purses, phones, sunglasses, can be sampled at your agency given that you have an appropriate area and clean room to use. Or if you don't feel that you have a clean, contamination-free area, they can always be sent to the lab, like RJ Lee Group, and we can sample there, followed by the analysis. So now I'm going to go over sample collection from vehicles. Vehicles are another common area for GSR samples to be collected from, obviously depending on the nature of the case at hand. The same method of particle extraction is utilized on the vehicle as is utilized on hands and clothing. Potential areas to sample from, including, but are not limited to, let's say the seats, headliners, door paneling, consoles, dashboard, steering wheel. The list goes on. When sampling from a vehicle, consider the flow of an incident before collecting. So what I mean by this, if a potential shooter fired a gun out of the driver's side window, you would want to collect samples from the driver's door before you collect samples from, let's say, the passenger seat or a rear passenger seat. Another thing to consider is the material of the surface that you are sampling from. Particles are going to tend to adhere better to fabrics than, let's say, vinyl, plastic, or the metal on the outside of a vehicle. If at any time during the investigation of a case you feel that you have a question about what areas may or may not be of probative value, please feel free to let us know and give us a call. We can always aid you to determine whether or not collecting samples for GSR is a viable option for you in your particular situation. So now I want to go over why correct sampling is incredibly important. In an ideal world, every sample that you would collect would have, let's say, hundreds to thousands of GSR particles on them. Well, that's possible. They could, and we have seen samples that have hundreds to thousands of particles on them. However, let's be realistic. We tend to see samples with a few particles on them, maybe one particle on them, or no particles on them at all. This is because of all the factors that I went over previously. Let's say weather, motion activity, time, washing, etc. Because of these factors, you want to make sure that you are collecting any and all potential particles that could be present to be collected. Therefore, we want to make sure that you're sampling correctly and efficiently. By sampling properly, not only are you ensuring that you are collecting any and all particles present, but you are also ensuring an easier time testifying. You can say under oath that you have sampled correctly and appropriately based on the standards set forth in the field. Now I'm going to go over some packaging considerations. Once samples are collected and ready to be sent off for analysis, you'll need to be sure they are packaged properly. Proper packaging is one way that possible contamination can be controlled. GSR hand kits typically are sent in evidence bags with samples, latex gloves, and seals. After collection, the samples should be placed in the evidence bag with the sealed with tape. When packaging clothing, items should be packaged in butcher paper prior to packaging. When multiple items are contained in one bag, cross-contamination can occur. Therefore, only one item should be placed in a bag. Now, this is important, especially if you have items that are coming from multiple people. Please do not place multiple items from multiple people in one bag. Please remember, the bag should be sealed completely with no rips or voids. Evidence tape should be used with your initials and date on the seal of the package. Please, please do not seal the bags with staples. We will photo document this, and it may come up during discovery. Once samples are packaged, they are ready for shipping, and now Marcia is going to talk to you a little bit about that portion of our analysis.
Hello, everyone. My name is Marcia Hess, and I'm the project coordinator in the forensics department. If you call our RJ Lee group and ask to speak to someone in the forensics group, I will probably be the one to take the call. Some of my other responsibilities include logging evidence into our database upon processing, as well as scheduling our experts for trial testimony, conference calls, and depositions. Today I'm going to go over the proper procedures for submitting evidence to our laboratory for analysis. As Mike stated, all evidence should be properly packaged and sealed. A chain of custody or a submission letter should be included with the evidence. Let's talk about the chain of custody. If your agency has a chain of custody, please enclose it with the evidence. If you need to obtain one, you can download one from our website. You can go to www.rjleegroup.com. Click on Submit a Sample. Under Complete a Chain of Custody, you will see three options. We have a General COC, IH Environmental COC, and a Vermiculite Analysis COC. For submission of forensic evidence, you want to choose the General COC. This is what the General COC from our website looks like. This form is self-explanatory. The fields that you want to pay close attention to are the report results to, the send invoice to, and the client sample ID. Please list the items that you're submitting so that we can verify what you sent is what we received. If you prefer not to use our online form, we ask that you enclose a submission letter with the samples. Here is an example of a submission letter, and we first want to make sure that you submit this letter on your company's letterhead. We also ask that you include the following information: the type of analysis, such as gunshot residue analysis, the case number, which would be your police department's or agency number, a list of evidence submitted for analysis. Again, so we could verify what you sent is what we actually received. We would also like for you to include a brief synopsis of the case, such as subject, victim names, right, left-handed. The reason we ask for this information is because a lot of times we'll do some casework and a year later we'll receive a subpoena for testimony. The subpoena number will be different than the agency case number. Without subject names, we can't reference what case needs to go to trial. So it's very helpful. The more information we have, the better chances we have of linking everything up as it comes up later for trial. The next thing that we ask is you list the report to contact information, which would include name, address, phone number. If the billing information is different than the report to contact, please list that. A lot of times we'll get evidence from the police department, however, it's going to be billed in the district attorney's office, and that's helpful so we can get this right the first time. Evidence can be shipped through any means that provides that package with a tracking number, such as UPS, FedEx, U.S. Postal Service, certified mail. Evidence can also be hand-delivered to our RJ Lee group. We have a lot of local agencies that just come on and drop their evidence off for us, and we'll have chain of custodies ready when you arrive, and we can accept your evidence at that time. Once we receive and process the samples, our standard turnaround time is 5 to 10 business days. Upon completion of analysis, We send all of our samples back using UPS unless you instruct us otherwise. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. I'm now going to turn this over to Allison Murtha.
Thanks, Marcia. And again, thank you on behalf of the entire Forensics Department for tuning in today. As I mentioned before, you should get a link to this webinar in its entirety within the next couple of days. Again, we hope that everybody's staying warm out there and that everybody is having a great day, and we look forward to seeing you at day 2 of our webinar series. Thank you much. Take care.